All right, today we are diving into a really profound shift in one of Christianity's most central ideas. We're going to trace a concept from the first century all the way to the fourth, and we'll look at it like an original blueprint versus the final building. And the big question is, what does that 300-year journey mean for a believer's conscience today? So let's just jump right in with a quote that might sound a little jarring to you. This comes from Philo of Alexandria. Now, he was a first century Jewish philosopher living at the exact same time as the apostles. And he wasn't a Christian, he was a devout monotheist. And based on his own tradition, he described the divine logos, or the word, as both the image of God and this is crucial, the first of all created things. And right away, that presents a puzzle, doesn't it? How in the world do we get from this figure, described as the firstborn of all creation, which is our original blueprint, so to speak, to the theological formula that became Christian orthodoxy, the finished building of a co-equal, co-eternal Trinity? Well, that 300-year journey is exactly what we're here to unpack. Now, to really get this journey, we have to be clear about the destination. And this is the concept most of us already know, the Nicene Trinity, which was established way later in the 4th century. It defines one God existing as three co-equal, co-eternal persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are all of the very same substance, or homoousios. This is our finished building. Okay, so let's go back in time. We're going to do a little conceptual archaeology here and excavate that original blueprint from the 1st century, the world that the apostles, John and Paul, actually lived and thought in. So in the 1st century, this logos was not seen as a co-equal God. Not at all. It was understood as a supreme divine being that was itself brought forth by God first. For Philo, this meant the Logos could be without any contradiction, both genuinely divine and the very first of God's creative acts. See, for him, those two ideas weren't in conflict. Now, this is really interesting. Philo, and our source argues that the Apostle John likely did this too, used a very subtle but powerful distinction in the Greek language to make this point. The supreme, unbegotten God is called ho Theos. That means the God, with the article. But the Logos is just called Theos, which means divine, or a God, without the article. It's a super precise way of separating the absolute source from its derived, but still divine, expression. So the crucial takeaway from this original blueprint is that divinity wasn't this black and white thing, either you're the absolute, uncreated God or you're just a creature. There was this third category, a supremely divine yet derived being. So the Logos could be the firstborn of all creation and be genuinely divine. These weren't contradictions, they were just different ways of describing this one supreme figure. All right, this really brings us to the heart of it. Let's put the blueprint of that 1st century Logos right next to the finished building of the 4th century Trinity and see just how different they really are. And wow, when you put them side by side, the differences are just stark. Look at the origin. It shifts from being the Father's first creative act to being uncreated and co-eternal. The relationship, it goes from derived and subordinate to co-equal in essence. And even the language itself transforms. The apostles used words like firstborn and image, which fit perfectly in Philo's world. But by the 4th century, we're seeing these new philosophical Greek terms like homoousios, which means of the same essence, a word that, by the way, never even appears in the Bible. So, how did this happen? How does a Jewish apostolic concept morph into a Greek philosophical and eventually an imperial creed? Let's take a look at how this change built up over those 3 centuries. I mean, when you just lay it out on a timeline, the time gap is pretty striking. You've got nearly 300 years between the last of the apostolic writings and the formalization of the Nicene Creed. This was not some immediate development. It was a long, slow process, kicked off by controversy and ultimately decided in councils that would set the course for orthodoxy for centuries to come. Now, according to our source, the debate in the 4th century was framed as a kind of false choice between two extremes. On one side, you had Arius saying, hey, if the Son isn't the unbegotten God, then he must be a creature. On the other side, the Nicene party argued, well, if he's a creature, he can't save anyone, so he must be co-equal God. But what got totally lost in this fight was that original third option, the Philonic and apostolic view of a derived, yet still genuinely divine being.
And we absolutely cannot ignore the political context here. The famous Council of Nicaea, it was called together by the Roman Emperor Constantine, who, by the way, wasn't even baptized yet. His main goal wasn't theological purity, it was political unity for his empire. He used imperial muscle to get the result he wanted, and any bishops who disagreed with the final creed, well, they were exiled. This theological formula was ultimately cemented not just by church leaders, but as official doctrine of the Roman Empire by the emperor's decree.
So this leads us to the real fallout from this whole historical process. What actually happens when a theological construction, one that's been shaped by philosophy and politics, is given the absolute binding weight of divine dogma? What's the cost of that? The source material we're looking at proposes a pretty clear three-part standard for anything that claims to be non-negotiable dogma. First, it has to come from the apostles. Second, it has to use their concepts, their way of thinking. And third, it has to line up with what they actually required for someone to be saved. So in this view, a true dogma isn't something that's built centuries later. It's something that was received right from the very beginning.
And that leads to the critical question, doesn't it? Does the Nicene Trinity, with its philosophical vocabulary, words like ousia and homoousios, developed 3 centuries after the apostles, does it actually clear this very high bar? Does it really qualify as a revealed truth that is binding on every single believer's conscience for all time?
The contrast here is just wow. The Apostle Paul lays out a crystal clear threshold for salvation. You confess that Jesus is Lord and believe God raised him from the dead. Simple. The later requirement, though, became about agreeing to a complex metaphysical formula. The argument here is that this fundamentally changes the terms of the gospel itself by adding a condition the apostles never, ever imposed. So, after all of this, what is the big takeaway? Well, the source proposes a pretty radical re-evaluation of the Trinity's status. And that brings us to our final and maybe most important point, this idea of releasing the conscience by properly reclassifying the doctrine. The argument is that the Trinity is much better understood not as a dogma, but as a theologoumenon. Now, this is a key term. It basically means a theological statement that is a reasoned, thoughtful opinion, but it's not a formal binding dogma of the faith. This isn't about dismissing it, not at all. It's about reclassifying it, recognizing its historical importance without giving it the same authority as divine revelation. And this is the bottom line, the core conclusion. A believer's conscience, according to this perspective, is bound to the gospel that the apostles actually taught. It should not be, and in fact cannot be, rightly bound by a philosophical formula built centuries later that has been misclassified as a non-negotiable dogma. And that leaves us with one last, really big question to chew on, and it goes way beyond just this one topic. If a doctrine as central as the Trinity can be seen as a theological opinion instead of a required dogma, what does that tell us about the proper role of tradition in defining the boundaries of our faith today? It really challenges us to think deeply about what we believe, why we believe it, and by whose authority.